In 1885, Carl Benz invented the automobile. Later that year, he took it out for its first public test drive and crashed it into a wall. For the last 130 years, we've been working around that least reliable part of the car, the driver. We've made cars stronger, we've added seatbelts, we've added airbags. And in the last decade or so, we've started trying to make them smarter with things like driver assistance technologies to try to fix that bug, the driver. Today, I'm going to talk about why we at Google think it's important to not just do what the software industry calls patching around the bug. Instead, we're developing cars that drive themselves, addressing the root cause of the problem. I'm also going to talk about how self-driving cars work. But first, I want to talk a little bit about the problem we're trying to solve. And it's a big one. 1.2 million people die on the world's roads every year. In the US alone, 33,000 people are killed. That's the equivalent of a 737 falling out of the sky every working day. Now, cars are sold to us like this, with open roads, great weather, beautiful scenery. But in reality, we often get this. And a lot of drivers want to do anything but drive. In fact, the AAA Foundation for Traffic Safety recently published a report that found that distracted driving was the cause of 60% of moderate to severe crashes, 4 times as many as other government estimates. And one of the most common causes of distracted driving, as I'm sure we all know, is text messaging. And when you take your eyes off the road for just 5 seconds, say to read that text, at 55 miles an hour, that's like driving the length of a football field blindfolded. Now, the AAA Foundation released a video with their study. And if you haven't seen it yet, you should check it out. It's actually some pretty harrowing stuff. We also get this. And if you live around here, you don't need me to tell you the traffic is getting worse. But did you know that between 1990 and 2010, the number of vehicle miles traveled in the US increased by 38%, while the number of road lanes increased by just 6%. So it's not in your imagination, traffic really is getting worse. And of course, all of this has a very human cost. The average American worker spends 50 minutes a day commuting. You multiply that by 120 million workers, and that's 6 billion minutes wasted every day commuting. 6 billion minutes. Let's put that in some perspective. You take that, divide by the average life expectancy, and that's 162 lifetimes spent every day trying to get from point A to point B. Think about that. And then there are those who don't even have the privilege of sitting in traffic. This is Steve. He's an incredibly capable guy who's blind. It should take him 30 minutes or so to drive to work. Instead, it's a 2-hour ordeal of patching together public transit or asking friends and family for help. And when Steve was given the use of an autonomous vehicle for a few hours, he used it to do things that you and I might consider a bit mundane. Picking up dry cleaning, getting fast food through the drive-thru. But this is the type of freedom and independence he often lacks. Seniors also often lack this type of freedom. In fact, here in the US, nearly 4 out of 5 seniors aged 65 and older live in suburbs or rural communities where they're dependent on cars. And that puts them at risk for social isolation when declining vision and health mean they have to give up those car keys. And studies show that seniors who are lonely are 50% more likely to die early. And there are so many others for whom a self-driving car could transform their mobility. So how are we addressing this challenge? Many believe that over time, incrementally adding driver assistance technologies, things like automated parking or automatic braking and stop-and-go traffic, will ultimately lead to a fully self-driving car. That's not going to happen. You can't add assistive technology around the driver and one day get to a place where you don't need the driver. It's not a continuum. It's a chasm. It's like me saying that if I work really hard at jumping, one day I'm going to fly. Definitely not going to happen. So let me talk about 3 issues that contribute to this chasm. The first is accounting for driver awareness. I've already mentioned that many drivers have a hard time paying attention. In a driver assistance technology, the driver needs to pay attention while the car is driving, in case he or she needs to step in. So back in 2013, we ran the first trial of people using an autonomous vehicle to commute to and from work. It was about 100 Googlers. We trained them. We told them the car worked well, but it was a prototype, so they really needed to pay attention. And as the trial began, we received the type of feedback that any product team would want to hear. We heard it was amazing, that it was life-changing, that not dealing with traffic on a daily basis had a real positive impact on people's lives. We even had this Porsche driver who was really, really negative in the beginning come back and tell us everyone needed a self-driving car, even him, because people were such terrible drivers. So as you can imagine, it was music to our ears. However, as we dug into what people were doing in the vehicle, we saw a few things that caused us concern. Let me share just one story. There's a gentleman driving on the highway, cruising at 65 miles an hour, when he notices his cell phone battery is running low. So he turns to the back of the car, like this, starts rummaging around, finally pulling his laptop out of his backpack and placing it on the seat next to him. And then he does it again. This time, charging cable. He plugs his laptop into his phone, and indeed, it's now charging. All the while, he was supposed to be paying attention in case he had to step in. Bottom line, the better the technology gets, the less reliable the human driver gets. And we weren't convinced that just making cars incrementally smarter was going to get us to the types of wins that we all want to see. The second issue is something a little more technical. Here's a graph. Along the bottom axis is the number of times the vehicle does something, such as brake, that it shouldn't. Now, you can mostly ignore that axis because you're not going to want to be in a car that randomly brakes while you're driving around town or on the highway. The vertical axis is the number of times the vehicle does something, such as brake, to help avoid an accident that a human would miss. So your average car today is maybe in that lower left-hand corner, right? It's not going to do anything wonky, but it's not going to get you out of an accident. So if we want to add a driver assistance system, like collision mitigation braking, to the car, we'd add a package of technology represented by this curve, and it has some operating principles. It's not going to get you out of all of the crashes, but the makers would pick an operating point, let's say here. So let's say it gets you out of 50% of the accidents that you would have missed. That's pretty amazing. That would mean maybe 17,000 fewer deaths on US roads. But if you want a fully self-driving system, then you need a technology curve that looks more like this. That might mean more hardware, such as sensors, and different software. And we might pick an operating point, say here, where it could get you out of most, though not all, of the accidents that a human would miss. Let's think about it in a slightly different way. Let's think about how often the system needs to take action. So the green dot is a driver assistance system. Turns out, in the US, the average driver makes a mistake that leads to an accident about once every 100,000 miles. So the driver assistance system needs to take an action once every 100,000 miles. A fully self-driving system, on the other hand, is taking action about 10 times per second, or 1,000 times per mile. That's an 8 order of magnitude difference. That's like comparing the speed at which I run to the speed of light. It doesn't matter how hard I train, I'm never going to get there. And finally, the third issue is how the system deals with uncertainty. Is this gentleman about to step into the road? Or has he just reached the edge of the sidewalk and now he's going to stop? It's incredibly difficult to tell. I can't tell, and no algorithm can tell. In a driver assistance system, it doesn't need to tell. It has the human driver. In fact, it might be a little strange if it did something proactive. So in the case of a fully self-driving system, oops. In the case of a fully self-driving system, it actually has to recognize what it's uncertain about and take proactive action, such as gently braking, thank you, such as gently braking, therefore definitely avoiding an accident. It is the driver, right? So now that I've talked about how challenging it is to create a fully self-driving car, let me talk a little bit about how it works. So first, the car needs to know where it is in the world. It uses a map and its sensor data. Layer on top of that what it sees in the moment. So those purple boxes are other vehicles, that red one is a bicycle, and at the top you might be able to see some orange boxes. Those are construction cones. It then needs to predict what is going to happen. So, for example, that black pickup truck is likely to make a lane change to avoid the construction zone. But it's not enough to know what just that black pickup truck is going to do. It needs to know everything that might happen. Quite a bit more complex, as you can see. Given all that, it figures out how it's going to respond in the moment. And then from there, it's just following a path, trajectory and speed. 2 numbers, right? How hard could that be? Well, in the early days on highways, our vehicles needed to know where they were on the road and where others were. But all the objects were headed in the same general direction, so it was really just a geometric understanding of the world. But once we started driving on surface streets, it was a whole new level of complexity. There are pedestrians crossing in front, cars going every which way, crosswalks, street lights. Very complex by comparison. And then it had to know how to do things like deal with construction zones. So here it recognizes that cones on the left are forcing it to drive on the right. And there are others moving through that construction zone as well, such as the bicyclist. It needs to know that a car with flashing lights on top of it, it's not just any old car, but a police car. It needs to understand that a school bus is also a different kind of vehicle, and then behave appropriately. It needs to know that others on the road have expectations of it. So when this bicyclist sticks his arm out, it expects the vehicle to yield to him and make room. And it needs to understand when there's someone in the middle of the road using arm gestures, that it needs to respond. We accomplish this through sharing data between vehicles. One crude way is when one vehicle comes across a construction zone, the others learn about it, so they can be in the appropriate lane to avoid some of the difficulty. But we actually have much deeper understanding than this. We can use all of the data that all of the vehicles have seen over time, the hundreds of thousands of vehicles, pedestrians, and cyclists, to understand how things look and then infer how things should look. And more importantly, we can take a model of how we expect them to move through the world. So expecting pedestrians to cross in front. Understanding that this bicyclist is going to nudge around the car to the right. Recognizing this bicyclist going the wrong way down the road. Understanding a right turn. And anticipating this car making a U-turn in front of us, yielding, and then going. So, learning is great, but we all encounter things that we've never seen before, or that we see so infrequently that we haven't learned behavior for them. For example, one day our vehicle was driving around town and encountered this very unusual situation. A duck in the road being chased by a woman in an electric wheelchair wielding a broom. Nowhere in the DMV handbook does it tell you how to deal with that. Luckily, we don't need rules for our vehicles for every scenario. We're teaching it to recognize when the world around it is behaving a little strangely. So, birds flying in front of it. Bicycles that you probably only see around here in Mountain View. Cars of all sizes, including really cute small ones. Here, there's a guy jumping on a truck. We nudge around safely. Or a car making a right turn from the middle lane. Where our vehicle is trying to make a lane change when the car to the left decides it wants to too. Or recognizing when a car is going to blow through a red light and waiting before proceeding. Same thing when a bicycle blows through a red light. And of course, there's this guy pulling in between two self-driving cars. Weren't sure what he wanted him to do. So let me go through one of those slowly. Here we have the bicyclist. That's that blue box. And you can see in the bottom that from our vehicle, you can't actually see the bicyclist. But our lasers do. Now, this view has a lot going on, so let me turn it. And maybe you can pick out the collection of dots that is the bicyclist on the curb. There he is. Now, his light is yellow. In the lower left image, you can probably see that. However, he decides to proceed through the intersection anyways. Now, our light is green, his is solidly red, but we anticipate that he's going to continue through the intersection. That's that red line. Unfortunately, cars to our left are not paying as much attention, and they go. Luckily for everyone, the bicyclist was able to swerve, and an accident was avoided. And when he made it safely through the intersection, our vehicle proceeded. So, what obstacles remain? Our goal is a fully self-driving car, one that's at least as safe as a human driver. And when we reach that point, they'll be welcome into our communities, and we'll begin to save lives. To that end, you'll find our vehicles driving around town, safely navigating the city streets, learning those pitfalls of driving, and becoming safer drivers on a daily basis. We've driven over 700,000 miles autonomously, and we drive 3 million in simulation every day. We don't believe there are any more insurmountable technical hurdles that will prevent us from making this a reality. And clearly, we need to act with some urgency, because during the time I've given this talk, 41 people have died on the world's roads. I hope self-driving cars can transform mobility and help change that. Thank you.